will be in the conversation, possibly in the Democratic platform or whatever. So I just wanted to set that context for you. I have had a long career, and for more than 40 years, I was working very up close and personal with people during times of deep despair. And I say that because when my career began, the AIDS crisis burst onto the scene. And I feel that it's been actually a privilege, a great honor, that so many, really I think thousands of people, have invited me into their lives during their times of greatest pain and darkness. It began with people who had been diagnosed with AIDS, but it became people who've been diagnosed with other critical illnesses. Somebody had lost a loved one, somebody found out their child was in trouble, whatever it was. And I feel that I've had, therefore, a lot of experience, not only being with people in times of struggle, but learning some things about what it takes to endure a time of crisis and transform a time of crisis. Now, my career began in the early 80s. I did a lot of nonprofit work, a lot of experience in such things as that. Around the year 2000, I began to see something that was decidedly different. I began to meet more and more people whose lives were in crisis. That that had become my beat, as it were. However, I began to meet people whose lives of crisis were unlike so many people that I'd known before. When my career began, I would meet people for whom the crisis in their life was the exception, but it wasn't the rule. Things happen. People get sick. People get divorced. Things happen. But at that time, not only was it that for the people I knew, the time of crisis was the exception and not the rule, it seemed to me I lived in an America in which crisis was the exception and not the rule. Around the year 2000, you began to experience, this country underwent a shift. I began to meet more individuals for whom the crisis was not the exception, rather the crisis was the rule. And I began to realize that we were starting to live in an America, as we do now, where a state of crisis is the rule, it's not the exception. It's always something. It's an economic crisis, it's an environmental crisis, it's a crisis of our democracy, it's some disease that's a crisis. It's always something. And I began to realize how many people whose lives were in crisis, at least indirectly, because of bad public policy. The crisis wasn't just that they got diagnosed with an illness. The crisis was that they didn't have health care. The crisis was not that they didn't have a job, but that they had to work 2 or 3 jobs in order to put food on the table. So I began to realize that as someone who worked in nonprofit work, spiritual counseling, etc., we were asked to help people survive. However, no amount of private charity or spiritual counseling can compensate for a basic lack of social justice. I began to realize that we were simply asked to help people survive an unjust system, but that the people who were perpetuating the injustice, who should be ending the injustice, it seemed to me as the years went on, had clearly no intention of doing so. And I was supporting candidates who I kept thinking, oh, you're going to do it. I just know you're going to do it. And I began to see that there was a system in place that made such ubiquitous suffering as I was witnessing a feature and not a bug of the way America now operates. Now, I'm old enough to have a real memory of the 1970s. And in the 1970s, the average American couple could afford a house. And they could afford a car, and they could afford a yearly vacation. They could afford for one parent to stay home with the kids if they wanted. One salary could support a family of 4, and they could afford to send their kids to college. I'm not trying to romanticize or glamorize what America's economy or American capitalism was or anything like that at any time before. However, more than not, the average American had a shot. Today, none of that is true. Today, because of a 50-year transfer of wealth to the tune of $50 trillion, money, a vast transfer of wealth, has been taken from the bottom 90% to the top 1% of all Americans. Now, the first principle of American democracy is that a first principle is that the role of the government is to broker a balance between individual liberty, which includes economic liberty, and a concern for the common good. There's the private sector and there's the public sector. Yeah, do whatever you want in the private sector as long as it doesn't hurt anyone. But that, as long as it doesn't hurt anyone, is very important. And the role of the government is to make sure that you are not hurting anyone. Something began to change. I'll give you an example. If this was the 1960s or the 1970s, and a reporter came into a local newspaper, because there were a lot of them still, and said to their editor, I think we have a problem downriver. That factory that's down there is spewing all these toxins, all these poisons into the river. The editor was most likely going to say, look into this, do what you can, investigate. As a matter of fact, it would probably be such an important issue that if the journalist did a good job, he or she might actually win a Pulitzer Prize. You know what would happen today? First of all, it probably wouldn't be an independent newspaper. It would probably be a newspaper that's owned by one of 5 major corporate conglomerates. Even worse, that corporation is very likely to be owned by the same company that owns the factory. So today, the journalist would say to the editor, you know, there's a problem downriver, and their editor would be very likely to say, you know, we're not going to cover it. Just leave that one alone. We're not going to cover that. In fact, there have been times when journalists have gotten in a lot of trouble for trying to do so. What has happened to this country? Well, what has happened to this country? We all know, actually, and many of us are old. Some of us, I don't know how many of us in this room. Actually, I'm looking around, I don't know. Maybe you and me, Sarah, are the only one. But we actually remember Ronald Reagan. We remember the canard. We remember the wool that was thrown over people's eyes. This idea, this ruse, this very pernicious ruse, actually, that the main responsibility of the corporation should be its fiduciary, its financial responsibility to its stockholders. And that, yes, this would create a very rich class of Americans, but this would be so good, see, because they would become job creators. And then they would release these crumbs in the form of jobs down to the little ones below, and that would lift all boats. Well, after 40 or 50 years, it's clear that it did not lift all boats. As a matter of fact, what's clear is that it threw millions of people off the boats that they were already on, and it has left millions of people without even a life vest. And there's a reason for that. The reason being that their business model was never job creation. Their business model was job elimination. Their business model was demonization of unions. Their business model was to squeeze every last dollar out of the workers. The business model was to make sure you did everything possible to increase stockholder value, but at the expense of the other stakeholders. The other stakeholders are the workers, the community, the environment, and so forth. And so this is where we are today. So in the 1970s, the situation of relative universal extension of opportunity, certainly compared to what had been true in the United States before, has been replaced by a completely collapsed middle class. Today, we have 1 in 4 Americans living with medical debt. We have 39% of Americans who now say that they regularly skip meals in order to pay their rent. We have half of the renters in the United States unable to afford that rent. We have 600,000 homeless people. We have 1/3 of America's workers living on less than $15 an hour, and 1/2 of them cannot even find a place to live. We have 70% of Americans who say that they live with chronic economic anxiety. We have the majority of Americans living paycheck to paycheck, and we have a majority of Americans who cannot afford an unexpected $1,000 expenditure. Now, there was a Supreme Court justice who has since passed named Louis Brandeis, and he said that you can either have large amounts of money concentrated in the hands of a few, or, he said, you can have democracy. You cannot have both. Because without a thriving middle class, you cannot have a thriving democracy. And especially since the Citizens United decision 14 years ago, because corporate entities have been given now unlimited permission to influence our governments through the dark money, through the influence that they exert on political elections, we now have Washington itself held hostage. Washington itself turned into a system of legalized bribery. And for the most part, in issue after issue and time after time, what we have is our elected representatives doing more to serve the short-term profit maximization goals of their donors than to serve your safety, your health, and your well-being. Even when your safety, health, and well-being and your goals for your life are totally expressed and they can see them if they want to. The truth is, it does them less good within that system to serve you than to serve their donors. That's why we don't have universal health care, like in every other advanced democracy. For no other reason than because, would you like to come on and sit up here, ma'am? Okay. We don't have universal health care like in every other advanced democracy. For no other reason than the institutionalized greed of the insurance companies. We're told it's a complicated issue, and I'm telling you, it's not that it's complicated, it is that it is so corrupt. Not only does every other advanced democracy, not only advanced democracies, other advanced nations have it. Not only that, but I found this very interesting. The majority of Republicans as well as Democrats, not as big a majority, but still a majority, say they want universal health care. I'll tell you what else a majority of Republicans as well as Democrats say they want. Once again, not as big a majority, but still a majority. Tuition-free college and tech school. Once again, going back to my age, I remember a time prior to the 1970s, we had tuition-free college and tech school. University of California had a system, Florida had a system, Texas had a system. I remember in 2020, when Elizabeth Warren ran for president, she made a big deal about how inexpensive her college costs had been. Please, come on over. I should have waited a few minutes, I'm sorry, I apologize.
I'm late, thank you.
Hi, how are you? We are now in a situation where the ubiquitous chronic economic despair of millions and millions of people is the new normal. We ask ourselves, where does the mental health crisis come from? You cannot overestimate the factor of economic stress in contributing to the mental health crisis. I want anybody who is not young to please think of who you were in your 20s, okay? Could you have taken tens of thousands of dollars of college loan debt? Would you be here today? Would you? First of all, debt is crippling. Debt is crippling. The medical debt in our country alone is $88 billion. Because as I said, 1 in 4 people live with it. Meanwhile, it's worth mentioning that last year alone, the top 5 pharmaceutical companies, their profit alone, which of course we're subsidizing them. Yeah. You're paying with your tax dollars for them to develop medicines and then they turn around and price gouge you. This is how the system works. Once again, that's the feature, that's not the bug. And their profit alone last year was $80 billion. The only thing that's really, really wrong here is that we're not up in arms. And we'll talk about that as we go along. So we now have a situation where 18 million Americans cannot afford the prescriptions that their doctors give them. This is an issue. The issue is not only uninsured, but underinsured. Millions of Americans have the coverage to go to the doctor, but they don't have the coverage to pay for the pills that the doctor prescribes, or the tests that the doctor prescribes, or the operation that the doctor prescribes. I've heard doctors say, I don't even know why I bother to practice medicine anymore. It just breaks my heart. We have 1.3 million people rationing their insulin. Now, I want to mention something to those of you who are Democrats, or for those of you who do not wish to see, even if you're Republican or whatever, do not wish to see Donald Trump back in the White House. The other night, how many of you watched the State of the Union? How many of you watched Alabama Senator Katie Britt's rebuttal to this? She is the one who mentioned that Americans are choosing between their medicine and their rent. Excuse me, that should have been our line. That should have been our line. But our line of the State of the Union, the President's line, was basically things are great and he's done such a great job and he's really made a little bit of a difference in everything that we're talking about here. Bragging about what we've done with prescription drugs, that within 10 years we're going to have some prescription costs lowered. No, we should have Medicare for all.
Yes.
What do we do? We have been so trained to expect too little. So my agenda is based on an economic bill of rights. We need what citizens, everything I'm about to say to you, like, take this in. Everything I'm about to say to you is considered a moderate position in every other advanced democracy. We need universal health care, Medicare for all. We need tuition-free college and tech school. We need complete eradication of the college loan debt using the Higher Education Act because they should never have occurred. It's immoral that they ever happened. You set your kids up to win, you don't cut them off at the knees.
Right.
We need subsidized childcare, which is a crisis for millions of Americans. We need paid family leave. We need guaranteed sick pay. We need guaranteed affordable housing. And we need guaranteed living wage. We have a minimum wage that has not been raised since 2009. The entire time, by the way, President Biden has been in the White House. $7.25. And the living wage in every major city in the United States, I'm sure in Atlanta, is over $20. So we need more than incremental change, which is what the corporatist Democrats represent. You know, the way I look at it, the Republican Party is a nosedive, but the Democratic Party establishment version is a managed decline. We're headed for the iceberg here. The Republicans are just headed straight, and the corporatist Democrats are at a different angle. It'll go more slowly. You'll hit it at a different angle. We've got to turn this ship around. You know, I want to tell you an experience I had this morning. I was doing a Zoom call with Democrats abroad. And Democrats abroad, mainly Europeans, well, they're Americans living mainly in Europe and in other countries as well. And they were reading me some questions that they were written down. And one woman said, and I can't remember what European country she lived in, a lot of them like Germany and Switzerland, places like that. And she said, we've made such progress on healthcare. What can we do to continue? I said, how could you allow yourself to even read that question? What DNC talking points are you so mesmerized by? Where are you living? And they all started laughing. I said, do even one of you live in a country where they don't have universal health care? And they all started laughing. They all got it. It's like we're all entranced. We've been trained to expect too little. We've been trained to say, oh, thank you for the crumbs. And then one party doesn't even give you crumbs. The other one says, oh, you got some cookies. Who can survive on cookies? Now, some people have said to me, Marianne, why are you doing this? Don't you understand that a fascist is at the door? So I want to be very clear about this. I'm doing this because a fascist is at the door. But a fascist should never have gotten so close to the door.
Right.
Franklin Roosevelt said that we would not have to worry about a fascist takeover in this country as long as democracy delivered on its promises. There are too many people for whom, what have any of you done for me? And that speaks to a real risk for those of us who do not wish to see Donald Trump be president again. I don't think that the danger for Democrats in 2024 is people voting for Trump. People who love Trump love Trump. They have a right to love Trump. They're going to love Trump. You could indict him 91 more times. They're going to love Trump. You could tell them something, analysis of his personality. They're going to love Trump. You could put him in jail. They're going to love Trump. That's not even our issue at this point. Our danger is people staying home. Our danger is people staying home. People for whom life is far too much of a struggle for one of the richest countries, if not the richest country in the world. I'm also very concerned about young people and the environmental crisis. The young people are particularly attuned to the environmental crisis. My age, I do believe the worst could happen. But deep down in my consciousness, I know I'll probably be gone by the time it gets too bad. For young people, if those predictions are true, at about the time they're at full blossom. How many people in this room, either you're a young person who has said, or you have heard young people say, under normal circumstances, I would be thinking of having a child about now, but given the condition of the planet, I don't think it would be a morally responsible thing to do. How many of you have heard it? And if it's true, please raise your hand and keep your hand up. Okay. And just keep it up for a moment, please, and lift it high. And I say that so that everybody in the room can look around. This is not normal. This is not normal. This is like a species shutting down. That's what this is. And yet we're like the frogs in the boiling water. At what point are we going to say, no, 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 no. If you're young people, if you're young, I mean, you kind of need that to be happening to sustain, the human race. It's at a point now where we're living, there's actually a book out there called Perma-Crisis. So we need to do more than slow down the ship as it heads to the iceberg. We need to turn the ship around. Now, I have run for president, I just have to stop here for a moment. The intelligence with this, I don't know you, sir, and I don't know this little girl, but you must know how smart she is. The intelligence with which she is listening, the look on her face, she's picking every word. I'm honored. Truly, truly. It's a little startling, actually. Wow. Thank you for being here, hon. And thank you for listening. That's focus. But if we're going to I want you to know, if you hear anything that makes you concerned, we're the grown-ups and your dad, we're going to fix everything. I do want you to know that. Okay. So, we are at a point where I think we need to turn the ship around. Now, the president does not have a magic wand. The president does not have a magic wand. We don't want our president to have a magic wand. We don't want a Viktor Orban clone here. The dictator in Hungary who former President Trump sees as his model. We, of course, have 3 co-equal branches of government, so I'm not saying that if I'm president, I can just make all those things happen right away. But as Franklin Roosevelt said, the main job of the presidency is not administrative, but is a moral vision. The president paints a vision. The president paints a vision of what he or she stands for, what he or she will appoint people to try to execute, the laws we'll try for, the things he will push in Congress, and also what we will use the bully pulpit in order to see. What I wish to see in this country is a complete economic U-turn. Because if you look at almost any social problem that we have in this country, economic hardship is at the bottom of it. So we need that economic Bill of Rights. We also need, and also there are people of color in this room, one of the primary things on my agenda is a plan for reparations. If the wage gap between black and white in this country were closed, our economy would be $1.5 trillion larger. This is not a sacrifice for anyone. This is an expansion for everyone. Anytime, just like Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, justice anywhere is greater justice everywhere. And I believe that we have a moral debt. I believe, my field has been spiritual and personal transformation. And that is where I got my interest in politics. I think that a nation, all that a nation is a group of individuals. And I believe the same principles that guide righteous living for an individual guide righteous policy. And for a nation as well as for an individual, you can't have the future you want if you're not willing to clean up your past. I also think it is time, and I think the American people realize it's time to repudiate the forever war machine that dominates Washington today. Yes. We have basically a corporate matrix. They are the main structure of the oligarchy, which is not just the individual billionaire class, etc., but this matrix of corporate powers. Insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, big food companies, which is why, for instance, we already talked about the short-term profits of insurance and pharmaceutical companies and the damages it's doing to our health. Also the food companies. Some of you might have read an article that I think went kind of viral a couple of months ago about looking at the ingredients in a ketchup bottle in the United States versus a ketchup bottle in Canada. There are so many carcinogens, GMOs and so forth, that are allowed into our food in the United States that are not allowed into the food in other advanced democracies and other advanced societies, whether they're democracies or not. All of that because of the influence of big food. What big ag has done to our farmers, to our farming sector, to our food and to our land. What chemical companies have done with chemicals that we know harm a child's brain inside pesticides. The guns that flood our streets for no other reason than the profit-making goals of the gun manufacturers. The ramping up of fossil fuel extraction, rather than ramping down. For all the talk the other night about the climate president, excuse me, there has been, under the Biden administration, some very fine investments in green energy. However, he's done more investment in big oil. He has given more oil drilling permits than even Donald Trump did. He has approved the Willow Project and so forth. The truth of the matter is, with our modern presidents, no matter whether it's Democrats or Republicans, they fall in line with big oil. And then, of course, with the military-industrial complex. Americans see this. John F. Kennedy said, we will either get rid of war or war will get rid of mankind. And we need to become as sophisticated and as organized in our efforts to wage peace as we are in our efforts to wage war. We should have a peace academy as well as a military academy. We should be playing peace games, not just war games. We should have armies of peace builders, just like we have armies of military personnel. This is not just symbolic stuff. Some of you might not know that peace building is an actual skill set. And there are 4 factors, and this applies both to a corner of an American city and also to another corner of the world. And the peace department, the Department of Peace that I wish to see, would apply and would be used both here for domestic issues as well as foreign. 4 factors which indicate statistically, if these things are present, there will be a higher incidence of peace and a lower incidence of conflict. Once again, this isn't going to surprise anyone. To me, it's common sense. Number 1, greater economic opportunities for women. Number 2, greater educational opportunities for children. Number 3, reduction of violence against women. And number 4, an amelioration of unnecessary human despair. We spend a fraction of the amount of money on the kind of humanitarian work that builds up peace and economic progress and opportunity that builds greater peace, and literally billions, if at this point not trillions more, on ways to wage war. I also think we need to end America's war on drugs. I want to give a little thumbnail history of this because I think when you see the history, some things become very clear. In 1971, Richard Nixon initiated the war on drugs, calling it America's public enemy number 1. I don't know if anybody's here old enough to remember Watergate and all of that, but there was a man named John Ehrlichman, and he was one of Nixon's top aides, and he was one of a few people who went to prison for the Watergate scandal. He came out completely transformed, like a completely different kind of guy, and he spilled the beans about everything. And when he talked about the inception of the war on drugs, he said that Nixon absolutely knew that it was not anything to do with public enemy number 1. It wasn't that. Drugs were not that at that time. And also it was intended to be, in large part, an attack on Black Americans. What we have done, we've spent over $1 trillion since that time. Clearly, it has not in any way solved the problem, but it has in many ways exacerbated it. And among other things, it has driven the prison industrial complex. Yeah. We have almost half of the people who are in prison, federal prisons today, are there for non-violent drug offenses. We have criminalized an issue that instead should be considered a health issue, as it is in nations like Portugal. Gabor Mate said, that it's not a war on drugs, it's a war on drug addicts.
Yes.
Now, for the $100 billion that we spend on the drug war every year, for a fraction of that, we could be funding a world-class network of recovery options. This is one of, I wouldn't say many areas, I think every area is this way. We know what to do. We have the people who know how to help people. We have people who know how to do regenerative agriculture. They know how to heal people's lives, how to have a restorative justice system. It's not like we do not have the solutions here in this country. The problem is the people with solutions over here and the people with power over there. And the people with solutions too often don't really have the power, and the people with the power don't really want to hear from the solutions, not really. They do symbolically, but they don't really, because to actually effectuate those solutions would take away from all the money that is being made by those who are creating the problem, who also happen to be the donors to our politicians.
Yeah.
That's how locked in this thing is.
Yeah.
That's how locked in this thing is, and you and I need to unlock it. We need a Department of Children and Youth because we have American children. You know, people ask about education. Asking about education today is almost quaint. We have children who are traumatized before preschool. I have met principals of elementary schools who tell me they have children on suicide watch. In public schools all around this country, there are regularly what's now called trauma rooms. Trauma rooms. We're bleeding teachers because teachers say, this isn't what I signed up for. This is crowd control. This is I'm asked to take care of behavioral issues. There's not even room to actually teach in this situation. And at first I remember being really enamored when I was reading about trauma-informed education and all of these things, wraparound services. But we have to ask ourselves, what is going on that childhood is such a trauma for millions of kids? It's not just what we need to do. What's going on here? What is going on here? And so I want a Department of Children and Youth. And if we're going to have the country that we all would like to see this country be in 20 years, we're going to have to give a lot more attention to our children under 10 years old today. Because some of them don't have. Know things about the developing child's brain that we didn't know even 15 years ago. You know, the brain is the new frontier, really, in so many ways. 90% of a child's brain is developed in those first 5 years. Now, not only that, so if you're going to have a child that's already traumatized by the time they get to preschool or kindergarten, you can talk about great educational systems all you want. And we also have children, and there are millions of them in this country, who go to schools where they don't even have the adequate resources to teach a child to read. And if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, 10 at the latest, the chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. Now, you don't hear this much in a presidential campaign. Why? Because they're not old enough to vote. So they're not a constituency, they're not old enough to work, so they have no financial leverage. So here's what's really going on in the United States. And here's the political system as it now exists. I want to go back a little bit and talk about the history of this country, if I might. Because I think that in our collective life, as well as in our individual life, it serves us to know what happened before. It empowers us to know what happened before. Because when we know where we came from, we're a lot more empowered in terms of understanding how we got here and what we need to do to move forward. So I want to go back to 1776. In 1776, some very brave men signed the Declaration of Independence. And I say they were brave because if the British had won the war, all of these men would have been executed as traitors against the King of England. And by signing that document, they created America's mission statement. It's our vision statement, it's our North Star. And there are 4 major principles in the Declaration of Independence that repudiated centuries of systems of oppression. Abraham Lincoln said that the Declaration of Independence is an eternal rebuke to all systems of tyranny and oppression. Number 1, that all men are created equal. I remember when I was a child, being taught about the Sun King, right, the divine right of kings. There had never been a system that even strove for that. Number 2, that we are given by our Creator inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. we call it self-actualization today, that you have the right to do whatever you want to do, be whoever you want to be, fly as high as you can, and as long as you don't hurt anybody, good on you. Number 3, if the governments are instituted, the government is instituted to secure those rights. And number 4, if the government is not doing its job, then it is the right of the people to alter it or abolish it. That was deeply radical in 1776, and it's radical today. Profoundly enlightened set of principles that opened the door of possibility for billions of people, changed the world forever. But it's also where it got gnarly. None of us are stupid. 41 of the 56 signers were themselves slave owners. Now, that is saying, that's America's story. That's America's DNA. It is our characterological bipolarity. We are both and. We have always been both and. The American mind is both and. We have always been the best of what a country can be and the worst of what a country can be. Now, if you look at the arc of American history, you say, well, what's happened? Well, what's happened is that struggle between these amazingly enlightened social principles and the fact that so many millions of people throughout our history, even today, get that this is really big. And our hearts get it and our minds get it. And there are people in every generation. Every generation reiterates the struggle from the very beginning, some more dramatically than others. And you've got 2 sets of people. You've got those for whom just how big it is obvious, and people who have been willing to struggle, sacrifice, and even die for this. And then there have also been, from the beginning, and even unto today, those in every generation who, for their own ideological and or financial purposes, have no intention whatsoever of seeing those principles actualized, no, and have proven and continue to prove in whatever ways, even unto the most atrocious, that they will do whatever it takes to make sure it doesn't happen. We should not kid ourselves that anything new is going on here. So, how did our ancestors handle it? Well, it's very impressive how our ancestors handled it. From the beginning, obviously, there was slavery, and then there were generations that rose up with abolition and the Civil War. There was institutionalized suppression of women. There was a generation that rose up with the women's suffrage movement, the passage of the 19th Amendment. There were the inequities of the Gilded Age. There was a generation that rose up with organized labor. And there was segregation and systematic oppression of black people in the American South, and a generation rose up with the Civil Rights Movement. The point is that in every single case of systemic injustice that I just mentioned, Americans rose up, pushed back, rejected it, said, that was then, we're not doing it anymore, we're going to do it differently. And I'm running for president because it's our turn now. Yes. Today, it's not a specific institutional reality that has us locked in. It's an economic paradigm. It is the very idea that somehow, for some reason, short-term profit maximization for the huge corporate entities, mainly the ones that I mentioned, should somehow come before your safety, your health, and your well-being. And as I said before, that means that we are no longer, the Battle of Gettysburg was the battle in the Civil War, at which it became mission accomplished, that the Union would be saved, the North would win. Abraham Lincoln went to the battlefield, he wrote and then gave the Gettysburg Address, and he said that the men who died for the Union had died so that, he said they had given their last full measure of devotion. He said so that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish from the earth. And I'm here talking to you today because it's perishing now, and we all know it, and it's perishing on our watch. We are government of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the corporations. And the 2 main parties service. One, however, much more than the other. And I grew up at a time when you knew that the Democratic Party, no matter what, the Democrats were going to mainly be the advocates for the working people of the United States. Today, it's got two wings in it, and the corporatist establishment element is in control. And I can tell you from my own experience, when I say they're in control, I mean they're in control. To the point where they make sure that anyone that does not toe the corporatist line doesn't even have a chance to run. Mm-hmm. And I think probably you can tell already from the things we've said, everything I've said here today, I didn't say anything you don't already know. People say to me, well, who are your supporters? People who hear me. And that's why they had me blacklisted on CNN this year, had me blacklisted on MSNBC, had me thrown off ballots along with Dean Phillips when he was running. This is very serious. Mm-hmm. The Democratic Party, the DNC, has decided, they felt that they were entitled to make this call, that because Donald Trump is such a threat to democracy, that they had to suppress democracy in this race in order to save democracy. I don't agree with that. So whether I can, as I said, because of that suppression, because if you're a Democratic candidate and you're not on CNN, which I was last time, I had a CNN town hall last time. They were satisfied to just act like I was a joke last time. This time they saw me coming, and they, as corrupt as you think the system might be, I must say it's more than you can even imagine. But I'm here because we have to stand up to it. Think how, wouldn't the abolitionists have felt, well, the situation's locked up? They unlocked it. Wouldn't the women suffragists have said, well, it's just locked up? Yeah, they unlocked it. The labor organizers, it's locked up. Yeah, they unlocked it. And certainly the civil rights, right here in Atlanta. They unlocked it. And I get disturbed by so many people who say to me that the whole situation is traumatizing. Don't you think the people who walked across the bridge at Selma were traumatized? We really need to toughen up as a generation to take on what is necessary now for us to rise to the occasion. And otherwise, it's one thing to have Donald Trump, if you say to me he's such a risk, he is. This is in no way to minimize the danger that this man represents. What I'm saying, however, is we're going to win by offering the American people a real alternative. You're not going to win by saying once again how bad he is. People know that. But it's not that people don't know how dangerous he is. But knowing how dangerous Trump is does not necessarily turn into the inspiration and the motivation to go vote for the other guy. So the American people, and I don't understand that, they used to say that Republicans fell in line and Democrats fall in love. It's become the opposite. Democrats are the ones who just fall in line. The DNC said it's going to be Joe. The DNC said it's going to be Joe. The DNC said, we've decided, coming up with ridiculous narratives like, oh, you don't primary an incumbent. Where is this written? Because it's certainly not written in the Constitution. And when I was younger, Lyndon Johnson was an incumbent president. Eugene McCarthy primaried him. Bobby Kennedy Sr. primaried him. I assure you, I was there. No one thought it was weird. We thought it was democracy. And it was important that they primaried him because this led to the end of the Vietnam War. You've got to let democracy do its thing. If your democracy is in trouble, the answer is more democracy. Democrats could have had a very robust primary season, and they put a lid on it. And that's what's happening in this country. I have had a very long career now. I have worked for over 40 years. My career began, in the 90s, a long time. And the American people are not the problem. It's not. The problem is this pluralic political system that acts like a lid on it if you have anything to say that is outside the lines. And I know from my own experience, if you want to form a nonprofit, that's fine. If you want to write a book about it, that's fine too. There are all kinds of things that you can do, saying all the things that I'm saying, and good for you. That's nice. you try to actually get political power, they're coming after you. And that is the way America works today. But today, I don't think they want to off anyone. But character assassination, absolutely. Absolutely. Once again, speaking of Gabor Mate, the author and the philosopher, he said that he grew up in Hungary. He said, I grew up in Hungary, I know what a controlled society is. He said, I'm telling you, it's even more controlled here in the United States because it's controlled on such a sophisticated level. And I'm speaking to you from the belly of that beast, and I feel somehow, I feel a little bit like Paul Revere. I think you need to know. But we also need to be aware of that which remains. And for you, as voters in Georgia, what remains is that you vote on Tuesday. And any vote for me increases the possibility that I can have a voice. And the way the system works, it's rigged in such a way that only people who have a lot of money, and when I say a lot of money, the president has $1 billion at his command. When I say a lot of money, somebody who was very empowered within the party said to me not long ago, the whole thing is run by private equity, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley. What happened to talking to the people who are hungry? What happened to talking to the people who don't have health care? Talking to people who have to work 2 and 3 jobs? No, we don't need to. All we need is the big donors in Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and private equity. Once again, Republican Party much, much worse, but it's become such a low bar. That's such a low bar. So at this point, there's only one way to override this, and this is through a massive movement at the ballot box. That's the only way to do it. Now, what happened for me, because I wasn't, see, last time I was on 2 presidential debate stages. I had a CNN town hall. You know, this time it was interesting. When my poll numbers were the same as Nikki Haley's, hers was called a surge. Mine was ignored. It was such an odd experience as a woman because I've had a long career. I never felt being a woman was to my detriment professionally. I never felt any of my opportunities were limited. I never felt there was any prejudice against me, any misogynist. I never felt that. In politics, it's unbelievable. Something happens in Bobby Kennedy's campaign or Vivek Ramaswamy's campaign or Joe Biden's campaign, it's described. If it's in my campaign, the most ugly stereotypes of who I am, what I do. This year I've become a self-help author, I notice. Isn't that interesting? Any possible thing to diminish you. Any possible thing. And of course you never saw my name without saying the word long shot before it. And those are just small compared to the kind of games that are played. But we still have that which remains. And if you do believe that the conversation that I'm having with you here, knowing that the issues that I brought up are the issues I would stand for. Now, one thing I want to say before we move into any questions is, of course, one of the things that you've been told, I'm sure, is that I'm not a serious candidate. And of course they say I'm unserious because they know how serious I am. I would submit to you that no other candidate has had as serious a conversation with you as I have had here today.
Yes.
And then they also say, well, if you're not buying that, please remember how unqualified she is. So their idea of qualified is someone qualified to perpetuate the system as it is. And they would have you think that only someone whose career has been entrenched in the car that drove us into this ditch should be considered qualified to drive us out of this ditch. I submit to you that too long in that game should almost be a disqualifier. Because it's a politics that is entrenched in 20th century thinking. This is why so many of our young people aren't buying it. They're not 20th century people. 20th century thinking is very mechanistic, transactional, just treat the symptoms. 21st century thinking, far more holistic, whole person. Let's talk about the root cause, treat the whole person. They don't even relate to that, which is very dangerous. Very dangerous. You know, we have to, every generation needs to be, you know, in the Jewish religion it says that every generation must rediscover God for itself. And I think as Americans, every generation needs to rediscover the Declaration of Independence for ourselves. It can't just be inscribed on marble walls. It has to be inscribed on our hearts. And if you go too many generations where it's not, it loses its moral force. And then we become easily played. And that's what's happened. We've been played. And you know what? Like anything else in life, I didn't realize it, I realize it now. And what I see in Americans, I always, when I travel internationally, my daughter lives in London, and I always, whenever I'm traveling outside the country, I always find myself at the airport hoping I get to sit next to an American on the plane. Now, why is that? Because I love how in your face we are. I love how within 30 minutes we're going to know, are you in therapy? I'm in therapy. Who's in a toxic relationship? Who really needs to set boundaries? Who's not going to take that abuse? I mean, we just right. I mean, other countries like this can't believe how we get right to it. However, when it comes to our public dialogue about political things, we've been trained to think like sixth graders. We farm out our best critical thinking. We've been entranced that, oh, the experts are handling this. Really? Because look where they brought us to. We're 6 inches from the cliff. And the same people who gave us Trump the first time are telling us what to do to save him off this time. It's the same people, it's the same technique, and what they're saying now is that if they can just raise enough money, have enough TV ads, that they'll be able to do it. I think it's going to take a lot more than that. I think it's going to take inspiring people. I don't want to go to Washington and fight for you. That's not my idea of a good time. I want to go to Washington, however. I would love to do that and co-create with you a new chapter in American history. It's going to take a real shift. You know, Martin Luther King said, we need external changes in our circumstances, but we also need internal shifts in our souls. We have to rise to the occasion inside ourselves. We have to get, not only is this serious, but, and to be honest, we let this happen. In too many ways, too many of us took our eyes off the ball. And in too many ways, some of the people that we disagree with the most have kept their eye on the ball. They've been taking over school boards. They've been taking over local elections. They didn't just come onto the scene every 2 years. They were there all the time. They were state, local, and that's where we have to be now too. It's going to have to be a shift inside us as well as a shift outside. And it's going to take some time. I can't accomplish the whole thing. No one person can accomplish the whole thing. That's never how social change should happen anyway. But I do believe that as president, or even as I said, even as someone that you, with your vote, give me a big enough vote, I can help get us started. Thank you.